Express Media acknowledges that the National Editing and Writing Students' Conference is being streamed from the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. We also pay our respects to the traditional custodians of the lands on which our artists speak from. We pay respect to the elders of these communities past and present and extend that to emerging community leaders. We recognise that sovereignty was never ceded and that colonisation is an ongoing process. It was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land.
Welcome to the National Editing and Writing Students' Conference, and welcome to Express Media's brand new online event space. My name is Magenta Sheridan, and I'm the creative producer at Express Media. I use she, her pronouns, and for anyone who requires a visual description, I have curly brown hair with a fringe, I'm wearing glasses and a green jumper, and I'm smiling because I'm really excited to be here. Express Media has been around for over 30 years, developing, supporting and promoting young writers through workshops that develop skills, through opportunities for constructive feedback and publication like Voiceworks, and through awards and programs that recognise excellence. We're excited to present our second purely digital conference accessible to writers and editors all over the country, with 2 days of discussions, presentations and workshops specifically designed to develop your writing and editing skills as you enter the industry. Tonight's sessions are publicly available for anyone to tune in, but tomorrow's sessions are for conference pass holders. If you'd still like to purchase a pass, you can by visiting the Express Media website, which is on the screen now. All but one of the sessions during the conference have closed captions, so if you'd like to use this feature, please click the CC button in the control bar of the YouTube video and they should appear for you. Our final session, Ask the Experts, will not have captions available on the day, but will be captioned in the coming week and available on Express Media's YouTube page to watch back. Thank you so much to our generous sponsor, Icon Agency, for supporting the conference, and thank you so much to all of you for coming along and for engaging. I hope you have a really fabulous 2 days and enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Hello again, and welcome to our keynote session, Future Tense Publishing with Adalya Nash Hussein. Adalya is a writer and editor whose work has appeared in Meanjin, Overland, Ibis House, Liminal, and more. She has been an Emerging Writers Festival Melbourne Recital Centre Writer-in-Residence, a Wheeler Centre Hot Desk Fellow, and shortlisted for the Scribe Nonfiction Prize. She is the outgoing editor of Voiceworks and has also edited for Liminal and The Lifted Brow. Thank you so much for joining us, Adalya. We're so excited to have you.
Thanks, Magenta.
So I'm going to jump straight into our questions. We've got quite a bit to cover today. Firstly, I know you've had a bit of an unconventional kind of pathway towards publishing, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, sure. So I think a part of my pathway that's like not necessarily uncommon is that I've always loved reading, I've always loved writing, and to be honest, felt from ages like 0 to 17, 16-ish. That was always what I kind of thought I wanted to do. I was very like, I'm going to do this degree in journalism at this university and all this kind of stuff. I was very like, that was what I wanted to do. And then to be honest, like it's a bit embarrassing to talk about, but basically I just like had an English teacher in year 12 who no longer bought into Adalya carries around fancy looking books. That must mean she gets a good score in English or whatever, and actually was like critical of my writing. And at the same time, I went on this like science camp that was very like, you're the future, you're going to be great, whatever, and was really like motivating. And I was feeling like less confident in my writing and more motivated and confident towards like science stuff. And so when it came to applying for unis, I was like, I'm going to do a science degree. And I did that with like intent to maybe go into like science communications. It wasn't a like I'm abandoning writing completely sort of thing. It was more that I thought that maybe both of those would end up being part of my career, and that science was something I felt more would be more challenging to pursue, I guess, through alternative routes. But yeah, it was totally just a bit of a like Who am I if not a girl carrying around David Foster Wallace kind of moment. So yeah, it's like embarrassing. But yeah, basically I started doing science and ended up kind of, to the surprise of everyone, including myself, majoring in maths, which I think kind of I found, and I don't know, this is maybe like really wanky and not true, but I think I found the way that math subjects were taught like more narratively satisfying than a lot of the other subjects. I'd originally been way more into like chemistry and biology, but those subjects are like always taught, or at least at like a first and second year level, were always taught with multiple lecturers and kind of in these discrete things that sort of did tie together, but we were never given the tools to tie them together. And I found that quite like I didn't enjoy it very much, whereas my math subjects, it was always one lecturer, and there was kind of a really satisfying build from like these blocks that would then lead to this like big, you know, theorem or proof or whatever. It was a more satisfying way of learning, I guess. And so, yeah, I ended up studying maths. And then within that, I started doing creative writing and English subjects for like my breadth subjects. It was at Melbourne Uni. So I think it was really good for me to have like a break from being a books person, strictly speaking, because I think that it gave me some time to like actually just be a person who wrote and read without like defining myself by that. Because I think that especially towards the end of high school, I was defining myself by it more than I was actually like doing it. You know, it was I was carrying around books more than I was necessarily actually reading them. And I think it was really good for me to have some time where it wasn't my identity, it wasn't what I was planning on doing necessarily. Sorry, that's my cat. But where I was realizing I still really enjoyed it and still cared about it being a big part of my life, even if it was just my spare time. And then going back and doing subjects, kind of realizing, I actually read a lot more than a lot of these people who are creative writing and English majors and who are still defining themselves by this while I'm not. I think that was really helpful to me, because I think that if I'd gone straight into English and creative writing, like I could have, I think, been really like intimidated by the persona of being that kind of thing more than the actual practice of it. And I think it was really good that I took some time away, was doing it on my own without feeling the need to project it, and then entered that space and was like, okay, I'm actually like at this level, even though they would judge me as not being part of it, if that makes sense. So then through that I wrote some essays and got some good feedback and ended up getting published in a few journals, including Voiceworks and The Lifted Brow. And by the end of my maths degree, I was like, probably don't want to do maths, probably want to keep doing writing and stuff. And I'd been on EdCom for a while and also done some other various projects. And so I went into the Masters of Creative Writing, Publishing and Editing, which I actually haven't finished yet. I've been on a break since the start of COVID. And also just was working at a lot of different smaller roles, like, just admin roles at various arts organizations, but that kind of put me in those spaces and stuff like that. And then from there, being on EdCom, editing for other publications, doing just like tweeting or admin or ushering and stuff for lots of organizations, like kind of worked towards leading me to where I am today, which is no longer the editor of Voiceworks. Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting hearing you talk about it. And I think we've had conversations before about kind of having one foot in and one foot out, and having that perspective of kind of being an outsider with almost more knowledge than some of the insiders. And I think like that is something that I really recognize in you. Like you do read really widely, and like I think people would have found that really intimidating, particularly in those kind of academic writing spaces. They can be really about, you know, how you're looking versus what you're actually doing. Those kind of things sometimes don't really match up. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to reflect on your journey through it all and to sort of look at how you've come through it, because I think a lot of people probably don't realize that it's not a straight line. You know, it is like a bit of a winding path, which is pretty cool, I reckon.
Yeah. And that's definitely not to disparage creative writing degrees.
No.
Like I know lots of yes, exactly. I know heaps of people who I respect a lot who took that pathway, and I think it's the right pathway for lots of people. I think for me it wasn't, because I think I was too wrapped up in it as an ego thing, and I think it was good to like have a bit of a kick in the butt and be like forced to actually be into it in my own time versus be into it as a profession or whatever, or as a identity, I guess. And yeah, I think it also like yeah, like I think that my reading, like there was lots of stuff on the readers. Like I remember I did this nonfiction subjection, like nobody else had ever read Janet Malcolm, and I'd like read all of her stuff. And I know I don't want to be like I'd read all of these things, but then there was heaps of stuff that everybody had read that was like expected knowledge or whatever, where it's like I hadn't read that, or I didn't realize that it was like the text or whatever. Like I remember I was like had written some nonfiction stuff that had been published or whatever, and was sort of talking to another guy who was a creative writing student, and I was like, oh yeah, you know, like I mostly write like nonfiction kind of stuff, and he was like, oh yeah, so you must love Joan Didion. And I'd read Joan Didion. I didn't like Joan Didion, but I remember just being like, that came out of nowhere. Like, what? Either like bastion of what nonfiction writers like, kind of thing. Like I just found it such a funny, like, you know, yeah, encapsulation of like, this is what nonfiction is, kind of thing. And yeah, I was glad to have some time away from thinking about, you know, like what I was expected, I guess, to be as that identity, to actually be that in my own world.
So you sort of set the topic for this event to be thinking about like the future of publishing. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what that kind of future of publishing means for you and how you're kind of thinking about it.
Yeah, so I sort of have like a really complicated relationship with, I guess, the word the future at all, because I think I was thinking about it in terms of like, this is like a youth media conference, and as like just the outgoing editor of Voiceworks, obviously a youth media publication, like I think like young people are often talked about as being the future of XYZ, and I think it can be this simultaneously really like grandiose and patronizing way of talking about us, in terms of that I think it both is like, you're our last hope, like the world depends on you, like you're going to change everything that we couldn't, or whatever, but then also it's like, but what you do right now, I don't give a shit about. Like I think there's a lot of like, you're the future, and it kind of implicit in that is you're not the present. And I think that like that's something that I really like. I think that yeah, the way that people can view Voiceworks if they're not reading it especially is like, oh, this is the place where like people who end up being a big deal are published or whatever. And it's like, well, actually, like depending on who's you know, like as a completely unbiased reader, like I think that a lot of these people are already great writers. It's not that they're going to be great writers in the future and this is where they get started or whatever. It's that these people are already really good writers. And I think that also thinking about ourselves as the future kind of means like the present doesn't matter. And I think can kind of lead to, I guess, like justifications of I don't know, like certain kinds of behavior, but in the name of the greater good for the future or whatever, or like, I don't know, that sounds really like menacing. But I guess that like, I think it can lead to everything you do feeling like a dress rehearsal for what you eventually want to do, which means that I think you're not actually thinking about how you're impacting the world at the moment or whatever. I guess like a kind of solid example, I guess like this is really like linked to how I think about a lot of like activism and stuff, which we'll probably touch on further. But I think there are definitely a lot of people in like arts, especially like progressive spaces, who really think of themselves and identify really heavily with kind of being anti-racist and being, you know, really like it's integral to their self identity. I keep repeating that word, that they hold those beliefs. But I think that holding it as an identity rather than a set of actions means that they're not actually analyzing what they do, and I think can end up being counterproductive, because I think it can mean that they're not thinking about, well, how is what I do actually impacting this? And an experience that I've definitely had is that like it's so close to how they perceive themselves that if you say, hey, like this thing is maybe not so good, it can be like it's like a attack on the self rather than a like, you know, soft suggestion for slightly different ways that behavior could be adjusted. It's this like, you're not who you say you are, you know, you're actually this evil person. And it's like, no, I don't think that way. Like I think that people will make mistakes all the time, and I think part of like having a positive impact on the world is being able to like try hard but also like move on when you fail, kind of thing. That like, and not be like dismiss that or whatever, and not like be like whatever, it doesn't matter, but to be like, okay, that happened and now I learned from it and I try not to do it again, kind of thing. Because I think that sometimes you can get so caught up on those mistakes that it stops you from progressing, because you're like, oh no, I'm terrible. And I think that's how I think about being part of the future as well, is that like the future comes fast, baby. Like, you know, like before you know it, like it's over, kind of thing. And so I think if you're constantly working towards the future and not really thinking about what's happening in the present, you're not really present, I guess, and you're not really going to achieve what it is that you're hoping to on like a micro scale. Like, yeah, I guess that like a big place to go with this is like my time editing Voiceworks has been 2 years. I've just finished in the last week, kind of thing. And I started in April of 2020. Can't possibly think what that would be significant for. And yeah, at the very start of my editorship, I was definitely like, well, COVID, I was thinking like, oh yeah, like 6 months. I don't know. Like I was on the like, it's longer than people think. It's going to be longer than people are saying. It's not going to be like 2 weeks. It's going to be like 4 months or whatever. It was a lot longer than I thought, as it turns out. But yeah, I think it was something where like I was really thinking about, at the start, I was thinking about like, how can this impact our future, kind of thing, in terms of like, especially like digital events and stuff like that, where I think in lots of ways Voiceworks was like more well set up to do those sorts of things than a lot of other Australian literary publications, just in terms of that we'd already been thinking a lot about the digital in general, in terms of our online publication that was really like looking at digitally specific works and not just being kind of a place because everywhere has to have something digital. And so I think similarly, it led to a place where we were already thinking about, okay, well, if we're doing a digital event, like what can we do that is like going to, I guess, recreate what is good about a physical event, and what can we do that we couldn't do in a physical event. Like really basic thing would just be we can invite like readers who don't live in the same city as the launch is happening and stuff like that. But also like what parts of a physical event just aren't going to translate, you know, like what can't you bring in? And I think I was thinking a lot, and I was getting excited, and I was like obviously really like distressed about the pandemic, but from a Voiceworks level I was like, oh, like we're going to be able to do some cool stuff that will like, you know, and then at the end of it we'll be done kind of thing, and that will be like a step forward for us, and then we'll move on and have that new knowledge or whatever. And it's like it lasted a lot longer than we expected, and it went really quickly from being this like future tense experience to being present tense to being in some sense past tense. Obviously the pandemic is still ongoing, but you know, my editorship of Voiceworks isn't. And yeah, I think if I'd stayed thinking about the future and what would happen after, you know, like I think a lot of places were also like, okay, we just have to shut down for this whole period, well, I guess another thing that happened in that editorship was I kept being like, okay, well, this is delayed because things are bad right now, but in 3 months, in 6 months, in 1 year, things will be better and we'll be able to like pick up the slack. And that's like not true. Like, you know, once you get to that moment, you're like, oh no, it's still really hard, and things have built up more than I expected them to, or, you know, we're actually still recovering from the mental hardship of all of those lockdowns, and that doesn't mean we're like ready to immediately start taking on heaps of extra work and catching up on our back catalogue or whatever. And so, yeah, I think there was like a lot of this imagination of a future post-COVID, and the future is a lot muddier than that. Like there's not an end date to the past or an end date to the present and a start date to the future kind of thing. And so, yeah, I guess that was part of what I wanted to think about when I was thinking about like, what is the future? Is that it's like not real, I guess. You know, the future is just a series of right nows, and you just have to get on with them. And obviously, you know, some of that is like you're thinking about a degree, you're thinking about a grant application or whatever that is going to dictate the next 2 years of your life or whatever, but that's actually really fast. You know, it's shocking how quickly that becomes the past, and obviously you should be thinking towards the future, but like I think also think about the present more, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think too it's worth reflecting on, I mean, I think like the things that you managed to achieve over these 2 years are really amazing, and I really hope that you feel really proud of what you've been able to do. I still think back to that first Voiceworks launch that was happening during lockdown, and it was such a freaking weird time. Like, yeah, and just seeing you as an Animal Crossing character on my screen while not being able to leave the house, and, you know, seeing other people that I knew read their work and share and just come together and be online in an online space like that really meaningfully for the first time was just so impactful for me, and I'm sure it was for a lot of other people too. So I do think that even though, you know, a lot of the time might have been spent thinking this might be different in the future or this is just for now, like I really do think that Voiceworks was able to do some really amazing things during that time. And yeah, I hope you're really proud of it.
Thank you, Magenta.
So moving on, I know you're really passionate about ethical editorial practices. Can you talk a little bit about what those look like in practice for you and how writers and editors should be thinking about them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what ethical editorial practices are really different based on the type of work that you're dealing with. So, for example, you know, if someone's writing, you know, whatever, car reviews, there are ethical editorial boundaries in terms of that maybe those car reviews shouldn't be biased by ad revenue and that kind of stuff, but potentially as an editor, an ethical edit can still be pretty like brutal in terms of that, like the writer is probably not like super invested in the car, you know, like I don't know anything about car reviews. Maybe this is like really really rude the car review community, but you know, I think that there are spaces like, I obviously am coming from a literary space where it's very long form, it's very personal. It's not necessarily, the writing isn't necessarily to serve some specific purpose so much as it is to be expressive. And so I guess I want to be clear before starting that, like, the ethical editorial practices that I want to talk about, like, they're working on a scale, and that there's still like ethics to be thought about at every level of writing and publishing and all of those kinds of things. But I am maybe working at this particular end that's very personal and that's very much about expression, and that there's like a sliding scale of what can be expected and what can be required. And and I think that you know, editors are people too, and if you're an editor working on a giant car review section, like, maybe you don't have time to. I'm sad, this is so. I've chosen the wrong metaphor. But yeah, like, I think that it's important as an editor to think about, I guess, what the purpose of the writing and the editing is, as you consider the ethical ramifications. What is the word I was looking for there? The implications, the ethical implications of your work. I think, like, you know, like, there's really core ethical stuff by editing and publishing, in terms of that I think is kind of coming to the surface in terms of discussing like responsible publishing, in terms of not letting people publish writing that's like actually just going to ruin their life, I guess. You know, like, I think that there's a lot of like more clickbaity publications who are pretty happy to publish work that is maybe not the most well thought out, but is guaranteed to cause a firestorm of response, that then they can turn into another article and it's all clicks, and it's not good for the writer. Like, the writer doesn't benefit from that exposure. They just both have a piece out there that maybe in retrospect they're like, oh, I don't actually agree with what I wrote there, like, but also, like, it's not a stepping stone for a career, you know, like that's just always out there now, is that their name is that they wrote like a weird take on some celebrity that other people wrote a lot of negative replies to, and they received a lot of death threats. And so I think that there's like, that's a really big ethical part of editing and publishing, is making sure that you're not exposing your writers. Like, you want them to write what they want, but you also don't want to give a platform for them to embarrass themselves, kind of thing, you know. And that sounds like really harsh, but like, I think that a lot of publications are really willing to publish work that is actually kind of embarrassing, even or like going to hurt that person in the long run, without really a lot of other merit other than that it will get clicks. From a more like literary level, I think that there's also a lot to discuss, especially about the editorial process. So yeah, like, I think definitely the way that a lot of writers and even non-writers, just normal people, imagine the role of the editor is, you know, red pen in hand, crossing things out, changing things, very, you know, like Gordon Lish, whatever, like completely remaking a piece and destroying it and hurting you, or having also maybe having really like commercial you know, taste, and not caring about the author's intent and just caring about what's going to sell and all of that kind of stuff. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there's absolutely editors who think about their job like that. That's totally like not a stereotype for no reason. But I also know far more editors who really care about writing and really care about helping writers bring together the best version of their piece. And that I think editing can be this really collaborative process, which doesn't mean that the editor deserves credit for the work or anything like that. Like, I think that sometimes there's this like like push towards like we should give editors more credit and give all of these people in the publishing world more credit. Like I think, and I don't want to speak to this because it's not something I do, but I know that there's a lot of like discussion around like translators' names, should they be on the front cover of books and stuff. And I know I spoke to a translator who was like, I actually don't really care about that. Like, I'm not translating because I want credit for my great translation or anything. Like I do it because I care about the job and I don't think I deserve equal credit to the author. And I don't want to like speak on behalf of translators because that's not my job. And I think that there's also just a broader discussion about how publishing handles translated fiction in general, that this is kind of a microdose of. But I think that, yeah, there was like, I've seen that in response to that translators deserve credit on the cover, people being like, and editors too. And I think it's sort of like, no, editors are really important. And I love working with a good editor and I love being an editor, but I would never want credit. Like that's not what I do it for. And I don't think that a good editorial process, the editor's fingerprints should be all over it. Like, yeah, I sort of talked about this at our launch. So if you were there, I'm going to be rehashing it. But like, I think a good edit, the best editorial processes I've ever worked on have been ones where I ask questions and I give ideas for how someone might deepen something. And then they take those and go to a whole other place with it than what I could have imagined, you know, where I might be like, oh, you know, maybe choose a different example here because I think this one is like, undermines your argument for maybe this complicated reason. And they work in that complicated reason and show how those complications are relevant to it. Instead of just like choosing an easier example, they're like, no, that complication actually, I didn't know about that, but now I'm going to expand that and work that in. And I don't think that I deserve credit for that, you know, like I don't think that that's I think that that's like really satisfying part of my job, but that's not something that like, now that's my piece of writing kind of thing. Like I think that that's really silly to imagine that. Anyway, that was a bit of an aside. Sorry. But yeah, I think like what an ethical editing process looks like is one that is like collaborative and done on the author's terms and built with a relationship of trust. Like I think that once you have a good relationship with an editor, maybe you will receive edits that at first you would have been really intimidated by, but because you have a relationship, you understand what they're getting at with it kind of thing. But I think that needs to be built up over time. Yeah, so like I guess one thing to think about that's like my starting point when I'm editing pieces in terms of ethics is not wanting to be re-traumatizing. Often people are writing work that's really close to their life, and I think that the editing process, even if it's like really minor word change stuff that actually is a typo and they agree with 100%, just the act of seeing that writing that they've taken so long to like come to the vision of what their truth is or whatever, seeing that change can be really hard and unpleasant. And I've definitely experienced that myself where, you know, there was just all of these, I'd written using a lot of adverbs, which I think adverbs are fine. I think that some people are a bit too like brutal on adverbs, but I also probably agreed with the sentence that they had taken the adverbs out, that it was better without them. But just seeing those adverbs like deleted was just like, I was like, why am I being so sensitive? Like, I don't care. Like, I'm fine with this. I don't want to be like a little princessy author or whatever. But it just would have been so much easier for me to, if they'd left a comment and written like, this is quite an adverb heavy sentence, maybe you can remove them. And I got to remove them myself rather than having to see them removed kind of thing, if that makes sense. So I would typically like a really basic, practical, ethical editing kind of thing is that just, especially at the start where you don't know how comfortable an author is or what, like you don't have a super level of rapport and trust with them, is to use the comment function rather than the track changes function, and to sort of say like, this sentence, you repeat this word, and then usually I'll try and say like, here is an issue and explain why that might be an issue, and here is a possible way of adjusting that kind of thing, you know, like, so both I've explained what the problem is and I've given a like concrete solution that if they want, they can just copy the way I would change it, but they can also have the opportunity to think about their own ways of changing it and implement those. And yeah, if they decide that my answer is the right answer, that they get to put it in themselves rather than seeing it changed. But they also get the opportunity to play with their own solutions, I guess. That's like my biggest like practical thing, really. I think that a lot of the times, like, it's slightly more work, but I think it's also actually good for you as an editor, especially when you're first starting out, to actually like question why it is that you want to change something. Is it because that's just not how you would write it, or is it actually a like real problem kind of thing? And what are the best? And I think, yeah, I guess that's that. I think is also just a good editorial practice, like from your own perspective of like having to double check that what you're saying is actually right, or but I think also it can like make a much more trusting relationship and yeah, prevent I think a lot of unpleasant re-traumatizing feelings of just seeing your words changed. Yeah, I think more broadly, as I was kind of talking about earlier in terms of practice versus identity or whatever, I think a lot of, I guess, I think there's importance to building like big policies, you know, as publications and as like arts workers, to looking into best practice, looking into like publishing guides put out by various peak bodies to do with discussing certain topics, and also be included in with those communities to see how they respond to that, because often those peak bodies don't actually necessarily consult enough with the communities that they represent. But yeah, I guess like I think that sometimes there can be a lot of thought about theory and not a lot of work on practice. And that I think that, I don't know, like I think people can think of power in terms of those big things like big policy documents and big changes. And that's absolutely a huge, powerful thing that we need to like work on and talk about and improve constantly. But I think that like it can make the smaller things that you do every day to make people feel more comfortable and more trusting feel really like not impactful, or like they're not part of the work, when I think that ultimately those documents are all just about making that work, those small courtesies that you can do, part of the automatic process kind of thing, if that makes sense. That like I think you want to be working on those big documents and you want to be thinking about that, but that on a real like human level, that just means like treating everyone with as much kindness and thoughtfulness as you can. And if you are so focused on I'm not like changing everything, like how am I going to change everything, you're going to burn out. Like that like as a Voiceworks editor, like that's a role with a lot of power, I recognize, but I didn't actually have the power to like change the whole industry. Like I think something I talked about is that I think Voiceworks has a lot of influence on the publishing industry, but I don't think that influence happens right now. I think that influence happens where in 20 years, the people who worked with Voiceworks right now, or, maybe even sooner, but, that like in the future, people who have worked with Voiceworks take that experience and replicate it, like down to really boring stuff like email templates, that like if you're starting a publication and you're like, oh, how did this other publication write out at acceptance emails? Okay, I'll kind of base it on that. But like I think that that's sort of a really basic example of taking behavior that you see and replicating it, and that being this like trickling through kind of thing, and that big policy changes are part of that. But also I think that there is power to those small acts of kindness and those small things, because I think that it encourages a culture that it's not going to change today, it's not going to change next week, and it's probably not even going to change that much in this lifetime, but it slowly gets better, and it slowly learns and grows, and takes those little bits and pieces and they get magnified. And yeah, I don't know if I feel like I've ranted a little bit, but yeah, I guess that's how I try and think about it, in terms of like, yeah, there is concrete policy and you should work on putting that in place, but also a lot of those policy documents are just, yeah, making a process explicit for how to be nice to everybody and how to be thoughtful to everybody. And that's just not being polite or whatever. That's being like genuinely like really like grappling with, well, for example, like I think, yeah, as the editor of Voiceworks, again, like I'm a powerful person, and even though I might be like having a bad day and a reason I might not do something as quickly as I should or whatever, might be because something horrible has happened in my life, for all that writer knows, it's because I am secretly have machinations to no, I mean that sounds really silly, and,
no, but I know what you're saying.
But like I think that sometimes I think that editors can feel really annoyed or disgruntled when writers like react in a way that feels extreme to you, because you're like, well, you're getting annoyed that I took a week to reply to this edit, but it's because I'm also a person and this big thing happened in my life. And but the reason is that there is a power dynamic, is that they're trusting you with their work and they don't trust you, you know, like they're scared that you're out to hurt them, and that there are people who well, not out to hurt them, but who aren't really caring about other people in that way. And yeah, it can be hard to be like, oh, I'm one of the good guys, I'm trying to do all of the good stuff, but you know, if you're not doing that on an interpersonal level, then you're kind of harming as much as you're hurting, I guess.
And I think also too, on like a similar sort of page, the writer only sees what you're showing them, you know, like their piece is the center of their world, of course.
Yes.
But you know, within the context of a publication, it's just not. And you know, they only know what they're showing you, because that's the only part of it that they get to be involved in. So
yeah,
you know, that's why it sometimes can feel, I think, so high stakes, because it is for them. Yeah.
You know, that like you know, from your perspective, oh, like it literally just takes me a week to read all of these pieces and do this proofreading and do this flat planning and talk to the designer and then realize, oh, I need to push this piece or whatever. But for all they know, you've just decided I'm going to push this piece months ago and then not bothered to tell them, kind of thing. And so you need to be, I think that you can personally recognize within yourself, I haven't done something evil, you know, like I haven't been negligent in my job, I've been doing it to the best of my abilities. But also that doesn't mean that this person is horrible for being hurt and being stressed, kind of thing, that you can still be soft with their feelings without like accepting them as your reality, I guess, if that makes sense, where you can be like, okay, well, I needed to explain that process better, I needed to maybe build in a level of the process where I say this is what's happening, or make more explicit that something might have to change or whatever. And yeah, we try really hard to lay out the process as clearly as possible, because obviously Voiceworks especially are dealing with a lot of writers who haven't ever worked with another editor before. And so, you know, they don't know like, okay, it goes through these stages of editing and then it might this might happen and this might happen and this might happen. You know, don't know that, oh yeah, flat planning, that takes like a week because it's so complicated, and don't realize the work that's going on behind the scenes. And that doesn't mean they have to, and that they have to be so grateful to us or anything like that, but that it can cause them stress if you're not, I guess, communicating clearly what the timelines and deadlines are. And that's not your fault necessarily, that's not their fault, but yeah, I guess you can view each other like with respect and kindness. And I think that sometimes editors I think sometimes writers can be unfair on editors because I think of that stereotype and of that stress. But I think I'm kind of understanding of writers having that perspective, even though I think it's like wrong. And I think that sometimes it can also lead to writers being really like, well, also there's definitely like a perspective on editing as that it's like secondary to writing and it's just something you do because you need a job and to be a writer. And I hate to break it to you guys, that's not viable. Like, if you just want to be, if you don't enjoy editing and you just want to be an editor because it's a career path adjacent to writing, like, that's not going to go well. Like, there's not a lot of spots. But yeah, I think that can lead to like really dismissive editing because it's from people who don't think that editing is actually valuable. So I think it's a bad attitude for writers to have because I think it has all of these kinds of ramifications. But I think I'm also understanding and less patient with editors who have that feeling towards their writers because as hurtful as it can be, like that's the power dynamic. Like that's that's still the dynamic that most editors will have with most writers, and so you just have to accept that they don't know what you're doing. They don't know that you're a person sometimes, and that's how it is.
As the keynote speaker of this extremely online conference, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you think the internet as both a medium and I guess a community kind of functions within publishing.
Yeah, so I think it's like, I think I feel both really optimistic and really pessimistic about the internet. I think I go through waves. In high school, I was like, I remember I delivered this really, as a really wanky high schooler, delivered this really cringeworthy speech about like internet as a community of practice, and I talked about like the Vlogbrothers and YouTube and Nerd Fighters, and I'm like, oh my god, I can't believe I did this. Like, it was like so optimistic and so like we're all friends and it's like including the fascists. So yeah, I have a complicated relationship with the internet. I think as a medium, I think that it's still really underestimated, I guess, in terms of the great kind of unique kind of work that can be produced out of it. I think that like like games and interactive poetry and even just stuff that like is really basic, but like Voiceworks personally can't print photos because we don't have, or like can't print full color photos because we don't have budget for full color printing. Like that's just there's just stuff that you can't do in print that you can do online. And I think online is still often seen by a lot of publications as kind of the ugly stepsister or whatever. You know, it's where you put the pieces that you don't think are really good enough to go in the mag, or that kind of a thing. I think that that's really sad because I think that that's not the best medium for, it doesn't do those pieces any favors. I think a piece that's not designed with the internet in mind isn't going to like read well on it. But I also think that it's a lost opportunity for what they could be doing with that space. So yeah, like I think I'm like really interested in like medium specific work, both for print and for digital. I think that there's a lot of my favorite like digital writers are also some of my favorite people who make work in print. Like I think of writers like Rory Green, who makes these really amazing digital weird kinds of works, but also makes these really beautiful zines that like are such just like good print objects. And I think that that's what I aspired and Mira before me aspired for the Voiceworks Online to kind of be, is like both a way for us to publish work that was really digitally specific, but also to think more about our print object as being print specific, that like print isn't default and neither is online. Those both have strengths and weaknesses and things that they can and can't do. And yeah, I think that there's like some really interesting stuff in terms of just like, I think publishers have made like print objects a lot nicer since like the great scare of the ebook reader craze. And not in Australian publishing as much, unfortunately, but I think that a lot more effort on publishers has been put into making print objects like thoughtful objects, I guess. But yeah, I mean, obviously it's an entirely different conversation when you start talking about like journalism or media, and that's not the space I'm in. And I think the havoc that has been put on those organizations by the way like advertising budgets have changed, the way like the requirement for click-throughs and all of that kind of stuff has changed, and then the way, you know, social media companies have encouraged the production of certain content that it turns out was not actually doing as well as they said it might be doing, has been really volatile. Like, I think that's really a lot scarier, I guess, and something that I think, because we're like aligned but different, I think a lot of print publishing people, or, you know, lit publishing, book publishing people have kind of observed and been really scared of. But I don't know about other journals, but Voiceworks was never surviving on advertising revenue. Like, they're just all, it's just a really different model of readership and publishing, and I can't speak to the media model. That's not my area of expertise, and it seems really scary and bad. But from a lit perspective, I'm like mostly fairly like, I think that ignoring it means you're doing both your print and your online a disservice. Like, I think underestimating it is doing those things a disservice. I think in terms of like, I think the internet in that question was sort of split into two things in terms of us being a medium, which is sort of, I guess, what I've talked about mostly, and then also being, I guess, on the like, again, on the optimistic side, you could call it a community, and on the really pessimistic side, you could call it like a marketing device. And I think it's both. Like, I think it's really hard to separate those in terms of that. Like, I've definitely found community online, and I love finding lots of work through online, and I think that's really great. But I'm also really interested in how we can do those outside of giant social media conglomerates. That doesn't mean I haven't quit Facebook. I mean, I don't go on Facebook, but I haven't quit Facebook. I haven't quit Twitter. I haven't quit Instagram. But I am interested in things like The Circular by Sydney Review of Books, that's about like curating, I guess, older, or not even that old, but just curating works that people are interested in. I remember my mum used to be like, maybe, I think it still exists, Arts and Letters Daily was like this newsletter that curated a bunch of stuff, and that I think now a lot of that kind of act of finding things, because of social media, we're being served so much, we're not looking for things that serve us things. But I'm really interested in, yeah, I guess like, you know, the Substack tiny letter thing or whatever. Like, I think that the algorithm, like, you can make friends and see cool stuff with it, but what are the other possibilities? Are there ways outside of those giant things for finding that? And often that will require being on the massive algorithm and then being like, oh God, I found out about this cool newsletter on here or whatever. But yeah, I guess I think really encourage, and how I try and interact is, you know, that there are just certain websites that I know I like what they do, and so I just try and look at them all the time and not rely on social media to send me their work and stuff. Because also sometimes when it pops up on social media, like, you just won't have time to read it yet, and then you'll forget it ever existed. Whereas if you're just checking in on things, that's helpful. Yeah, I don't know. I think that again, I am like, have a tortured relationship with, I guess, the way that it can be a form of identity construction, where you're publicly a person who cares about this, but how does that actually interact with what you do? And so I try pretty hard not to be too online. I don't know. I think I've told quite a few people in my life, I'm like, if I'm tweeting, I am unwell. Like, know this. Like,
this is a cry for help.
Yeah, like it is, which is not, I don't want to project that onto other people because I don't think it is, but I think that sometimes it can be like, there's sometimes like, okay, sorry, this is an edit point because I went on a really weird rant about social media that was maybe more about like my own relationship to the internet than something that is advice that I would actually want to give and put into the world. So now we're going to move on to another question. Magenta, go.
So this will probably be our last question, and it's one that Adalya gets asked a lot, but I do think it is worth talking about still. What are some common problems that you see in young writers' work, and how do you feel like they could be easily fixed?
So I think the biggest problem I see is, and this is maybe specific, the way I'll phrase it is specific to nonfiction, but I think it's actually true across the board, is you see writers who haven't read very much, which is not to say you have to have read all of these great canon or whatever, but that I think that, I guess like the hard example would be, we get pitches where it's someone who wants to write about this particular topic and that it's like, why do you want to write about this? And they're like, I've never, nobody's writing about it from this angle. People are always talking about XYZ, but they're never talking about it from the perspective of this or whatever. And then as an editor, I'm like, that's simply not true. I've read many, many pieces that are talking about this from that angle. And I guess, like, from a nonfiction point of view, that's like a research issue in terms of that it's like, oh, you're not really like aware of the relevant literature to what you're doing, that like you might still have a really interesting and original way of like working with that, but you don't know enough about the existing writing that's already out there to differentiate yourself from it. You can't say like, yeah, there's this really interesting take and I want to kind of expand on that or subvert that or challenge that kind of thing. And like, I think it's really obvious in a pitch because people are saying like, I'm going to do this thing that doesn't exist. And then you're like, it does exist. But I think that you see it as well in other ways in terms of fiction and poetry and other kinds of writing where it's just clear people aren't like familiar with how like familiar what their writing is. I think that there's a lot of like really well-trodden kind of imagery and ideas and stuff. And it's not necessarily that they're inherently bad or not useful, but that they've just been used. Yeah, I guess that if you had read more in that space, you would have seen it used and subverted and done all of these interesting things, and that you would have slightly more of an idea of how to adjust kind of thing. And yeah, again, I don't want this to sound like, oh, there's some canon you have to have read, and like if you haven't read every Charles Dickens novel, like get out, pleb, get good, or whatever. Like, but I think that and I think that it's fine to also write stuff that's derivative, and write stuff that's trophy, and write stuff that that later you look back on and are like, oh, now I have seen a whole bunch of stuff that's different. I think that's fine. But I guess that my advice to writers on how to improve is reading. Like I don't know, that's like sounds really boring and basic and also maybe a little bit like patronizing. But yeah, definitely I just think like having an understanding of where your work fills within a context. What writers are you trying to speak to? What work is it that your writing is in conversation with? What are you drawing from? What are you rejecting? That kind of thing, I think, just makes your work so much richer and so much more original and so much more relevant, I guess. That like, yeah, sometimes you'll read something and you're like, this is an article that could totally be published, but there's also 5 other massive articles that are really similar kind of thing. And maybe this writer has another angle that they can bring in that would make it really different, but they haven't realized that they need to, I guess. Yeah.
And I think on a similar note, like reading the publication that you're pitching to. I know people.
Oh yeah, totally. I know it sounds. It's such a like. I think that it can sound really patronizing again to be like, read where you're writing for, because I think that it can also often come off as like, subscribe to us, support us so we can pay you kind of thing. And I think that can be like, I don't know, I don't feel comfortable being like, subscribe so that you can submit and stuff like that. But I think it's true that you should, like, just from the perspective of me being a writer, like taking out that whole editor side of it, like I don't want my writing to appear somewhere where like it's actually going to appear amongst whatever white supremacist screeds, you know, like that's an extreme example, but you want your work to appear in a context that's actually what you imagine for it, and speaking and building and going to find the readers that are going to enjoy it the way you want them to. You know, if you're writing you know, the next American Psycho, you probably don't want to like have an excerpt of it in Frankie. Like it's probably just not the right readership. And that's not to say anything wrong about your American Psycho short story Magenta or about the publication of Frankie, but just that like they're not, you know, you're wasting your time sending it to them because they're not going to publish it. But even if they did publish it and, you know, you got published everywhere you sent your writing to, like, might not be the right place for it. Like you might, you know, the readers might be like, we hate this. I think it's so fascinating looking at Goodreads. Sometimes you'll see a book that will have like a weirdly low score and I'll be like, oh, look, I didn't think this was a 5 out of 5, but I'm kind of confused as to why it has such a low score. And it'll often be that it's been put on some like mass market book list or whatever, or it's been compared to Gone Girl, like all of the cover quote has been comparing it to something. And it's like, this does these writers a disservice because it, for the publisher's perspective, it sells more books, you know, they've sold way more books than they otherwise would have. But like, it's going to probably fuck with the rest of that writer's career because like all these people hate their book now and they got a really negative reception to it because it was being
read through a lens that they weren't intending to be read through, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, like, it sounds really like silly and a little bit like, I remember when I was like, well, when I was like being told like, oh, you might want to publish these places, I would like buy them to read them because I was like, is this place good enough for me? But I remember like thinking it was a little bit like, oh, okay, like I have to read you to be a part of your community or whatever, and feeling like it was a bit of a like insular request. But I do think that as a writer, you're doing yourself a disservice if you're not familiar with the places that you're sending your work and if it's going to be the right fit.
Yeah, and if you can't, you know, go out and buy something, like try and see what's available on their website. Obviously, we talked about the difference between print and digital, totally. But still, you know, that's a way to get it. And also, if they're stocked in a library, that can be a really great place. I know Voiceworks is stocked in lots of libraries. So,
yeah, well, I remember when I was in uni, Melbourne Uni had a the Rowden White Library, which wasn't like one of the official libraries, but was the like student union library or whatever. It had a really good selection of like journals and magazines, and it was such a great way of sort of both suddenly getting a bit more of a picture of the Australian literary scene, but also getting to see those publications and read a bit from them. And yeah.
All right. Well, we might finish up there. Thank you so much, Adalya, for joining us and for being part of the news conference for 2022 and for being our keynote speaker. It's been a real pleasure to hear from you. And thank you for being so generous with your advice and for sharing so much with us. I feel like everyone would have got a lot out of it.
Thank you, Magenta.
Thank you. And everyone who is watching, please do stick around for our next session with Maddie Clark and Jinghua Kyon. We're just getting started. They're going to share some tips and stuff for getting started in the industry, and that's going to be starting at 6:40. And I will see you all soon. Bye.